How y'all doing, Maryland? All right, we'll work on that. Okay, my name is Jammin' Sam Miller. I am a composer and a filmmaker, and I'm here today to show you a method that I pioneered about 2 years ago for restoring music to the Super Nintendo soundtracks. Now this term restoration is a bit of a misnomer because it's generally used to refer to paintings that are restored when, you know, they're really old and they get gunk and grime built up on them, and restoration kind of scrubs them away. But what I do with the Super Nintendo is a little bit different because if you go with the metaphor, referring to the gunk and grime would refer to low quality audio. And you can't exactly scrub that away because restoration is a subtractive process, and the Super Nintendo's low quality is, well, it's subtractive itself. So meaning that you can't just scrub bad audio quality away, essentially. So what we have to do is completely rebuild the soundtrack using the same sounds that the composers used combined with the audio data from the ROM. And so let's say you know nothing about Super Nintendo soundtracks. They were created not non-linearly, meaning that they weren't just, someone didn't just make a song in a DAW and put it into the game and put a recording into the game. They had to be, it's like they had to make samples of each instrument. So they would make a sample of one note, so they would sit on a piano, bing, record that, and then put it into the game, and then the game would play the notes and the music. So essentially, when you're playing a Super Nintendo soundtrack, what you're hearing is the game playing the music back to you in real time, which is pretty cool. But they didn't do it because it was cool. They did it to save space. You know, a linear recording is a lot bigger than one single note just played a bunch of times at different pitches. So, and for those that didn't know, the Super Nintendo ROM was about the size of a single MP3 song today. So it's pretty amazing that they were able to fit all that they did into those Super Nintendo games. Now, rewind a little bit of background about me and how I discovered this is I did not know music, and I picked up music as a child, and someone told me, hey, you have a good ear, you should do music. And I said, well, I can't play an instrument. They said, well, you don't need to. You can download a computer program and do music digitally. And so I downloaded FL Studio, and not knowing a single bit of music, I've just done music ever since. I downloaded FL Studio and I made something and I sent it to that same friend, and he said, this sounds like shit. And it did. And so I kept at it, and years later, I was able to perfect my musical ability and become pretty good. So, and one thing that I had always loved was the Donkey Kong Country soundtrack. That is mainly the thing that inspired me to become a musician, because I always felt that the sounds, they were so colorful, there were so many musical flavors in the soundtrack and so many different styles, and that just really it really ignited a passion in me for everything that music could be and all the different, ways that it could be strung. So I carried that soundtrack with me, kind of in my head wherever I went. And when I learned music, I never forgot it. I learned to play the melodies on keyboard, and it just stuck with me. So what happened is about 4 years ago now, in 2018, I found this program that allowed me to look at everything that goes on inside a Super Nintendo soundtrack. So if you look at this is Spc Tool. It's a hellishly old program. I think it was written in the DOS, well, not the DOS days, but it was written for DOSBox, if that gives you an idea. So it freezes a lot, but it was able to show me what goes on inside a Super Nintendo soundtrack. So I have loaded the Donkey Kong Country soundtrack, and here are all the songs, and here are all the instrument samples shown in the song. So, and this was mind-blowing for me because it was when I first learned that, okay, this is how these soundtracks were created. They have all these different instrument samples, And more importantly, it allowed me to save these instrument samples so that I could use them in FL Studio. And so what I did was, well, backtrack. Here's what it looks like when you play a song. You see, you have all this data going on. This is the pitch data in hertz. And this is if it has reverb on it. And this is the sample that's being used. And this is the volume data. So you can see, and you can see the 8 channels here. I can play them independently. So this was incredibly cool for me, mainly because it allowed me to export all the samples. And what I did was I was able to recreate all that volume data and pitch data as vibrato and envelopes into what's called a sound font file. And so I was able to create this. I was able to recreate all the instruments and put them into this file, and now you could play them in your DAW. You could have all the instruments and just play them like that. I don't have my keyboard, so I can't play anything for you right now, but if we look at one of the most famous video game songs in history, Aquatic Ambience, you can hear that here is the voice file that plays at the voice patch that plays at the beginning. And so I put this online. Everybody seemed to like this. They seemed to enjoy playing with it, and someone even made a fan game called Donkey Kong Country 4, and people started making music, custom music using it. But that was all well and fine, but it was still compressed. And when I was doing this, I wasn't thinking, oh, I could restore music this way. No, I was just kind of exploring. And so what that got me thinking of was, where did these sounds come from? I knew they had to come from somewhere. So what I did was I researched into what the composer did, David Wise. In interviews, he's mentioned several times that he's used the Korg wave station as his main inspiration for the soundtrack. So I said, well, I can't afford a Korg wave station, but I found a VST, or a virtual instrument, that was basically emulating the wave station. And I bought it from the Korg website, and lo and behold, you have that same wave, but it's in much clearer, pristine quality. So I pull it up, you can hear it's a voice, it's a synth voice. And so what that meant was, like, I now have access to the sounds in a high quality. Now, this wasn't the only thing he used. I went and got a list from Sir David Wise for the rest of the equipment list that he used. But basically, I was able to say, okay, now I have these instruments in high quality. But that wasn't the only piece I needed, because you can't exactly just recreate guess about the notes that they're playing. It's not really accurate. So what I had to do then was I had to find a way to go into the ROM and get the music instruction data out of the ROM in a way that could be read by this computer. Now, one problem is that it was not written in MIDI format. If you don't know what MIDI format is, it's basically the file, the sort of like language that computers use to read music. It has the note data in it, and it has, note start, note stop, and pitch and volume and things like that, and velocity. But the Super Nintendo music was not written with this in mind. It was written in hex format to save space. So everything was little hexadecimal digits, it just basically just numbers and letters. So what I had to do was I had to go and convert this data into something that the computer could read. And I found a program to do this, and it converted all the data into MIDI format, and it basically sounded like this. Wait, not yet. So the instruments were all pointing to the wrong place. None of it sounded like it should. And we got into even crazier things it sounded even crazier when you had drums, and the drums would point to melodic instruments. And that really did not sound right. So what I had to do was then I would go into, I had all the note data here. And so you can see this is that synth voice line that is being played right here. So I would go and copy this down. And say, okay, now I put this in the Korg wave station slot and it plays. But we still had a problem. There's note echoes in here. The way that the Super Nintendo made delay or echoes, it basically just repeated the notes. So what I had to do is I go and delete all these extra notes, and then you have. But then we had a problem because the notes are short. So I had to add and the volume data is not really listed in here. MIDI doesn't read the volume data. So I had to go and put an envelope on it, basically tell the Korg wave station, hey, this is how long these notes are supposed to be. So I go and modify the amplitude envelope. And that sounds pretty good. And then I had to add reverb, which I've already have reverb here. But I also had to add delay to emulate how those note delays that are in the song. So I think I've already done this here. Now, if you coordinate that with the song, with that one channel in the song, that sounds pretty good, but it's using some panning here that I don't have. So when I go to the song, you see the panning data does this number here. And I didn't quite have that. And the thing is, like, each echo changes, it changes speaker. So it goes ping pong, like back and forth, back and forth. So I had to go and copy that data and basically copy that data and remove all the little ping pongs back and forth, and I came up with this. So if I copy this here, then you come up with those echoes again. And if you tell the delay channel to switch to also ping pong the delays, like I have done here, you get that same sound. And then, so that's like one channel. And then there's also another echo on these. Let me find it here. There's also another echo on this channel. That's what gives it that signature flowy sound. So I had to recreate that, but the envelope is a little bit different. It's a longer articulation, so I had to add this again instead of using a delay. And it basically came up with like, this is it, one of them by itself. If you could hear that. I think it's a little bit quiet. That's one of them by themselves, and then when you add the other delay, you get. So you see it sounds pretty similar, but it's a lot more clear. And now you have and once you add all these other instruments and you put it together, it sounds like. So you see, everything is created from scratch again, using the same data that was in the ROM, albeit crudely converted back to MIDI format into a way that this computer can understand. And so I did this and I put it on YouTube, and I started doing this with other soundtracks, or the other tracks in the game. And I forgot to put that on YouTube, and then someone stole my work for a second. But they once I started putting it on YouTube, once I started putting it on YouTube regularly, you know, that went away. But I have the whole soundtrack done on YouTube, and it's all in. You can find it on YouTube. It's all in play. There's a playlist for each game, and I also did Super Metroid. So that's all done. And then when I did that, someone told me, hey, there's something called an MSU1 patch, which allows you to take a Super Nintendo game and put custom music on it and patch the ROM so that music plays on its own. So, and I had a friend that told me, hey, I can basically like reformat your soundtrack, the FLACs, because I did this in FLAC and MP3 format. And FLAC, if you don't know anything about that, it's a lossless format, so it's very high quality. And so they offered to put this in the game for me, essentially. And this was a guy whose name was No Name, and so No Name SD, he did some digital wizardry, and basically formatted the soundtrack for the MSU1 patch. And so whenever you load up the game, if you apply the patch, you get the game with the music on it. So now freely play the game. My bad. I don't even know how that happened. All right, let's try again. All right. Let me try restarting it and see what we get. Alright, seem to be having a little bit of technical difficulties here. Seem to be having a little bit... but you get the idea. You can now play the game with the soundtrack on it. And so, I don't know if anybody can help with this, but let's see. Here we go. I think I've fixed it now. With the soundtrack on it, with the restored soundtrack. And so but you get the idea. So now we can do this. And people have asked me, like, hey, why don't you do other soundtracks? And I say, well, I'm not exactly that big, much into the Super Nintendo soundtracks. But I have, which is why I've put everything, all the project files and stuff is open source. So everything's on Dropbox. If people want to, they can go and look at the FL Studio files and everything I have done for this. I've done this for all 3 Donkey Kong Country games and Super Metroid. And so all of those are online. They're on YouTube, and you can download them for free. And that's kind of that. But do I have any questions? Does anybody have any questions about this stuff? Yes, you over there. Well, it takes about 6 hours per track. So what I do is I live stream every song that I do on my YouTube channel. So if you go on my YouTube channel, you can see all the process for everything that I've done being done in live time, from an empty project to the entirety of the song being done on YouTube. So if anyone's interested in like following up on these, they can go and look at that. So that answer your question? All right. Anybody else? Yes. It wasn't too hard to find some of the sounds, because the Wave Station, it has all the sounds listed, and you can kind of go through it, and they're listed pretty well. But what was really difficult was some of the sounds that were used weren't even listed in the in Sir David Wise's equipment list. So I had to go and look through, particularly the sound effects, and this was because they had a dev kit for the Super Nintendo when it was originally released. So Dave had that to work with, and he pulled a lot from that dev kit, and that meant it could have been anywhere. And since there was no one rep from Nintendo to tell me what was actually included in that kit, I had to kind of just search around everywhere for some of these sounds. Some of these sounds are very hard to find, especially the sound effects. And some of the sound effects were also recorded like by Rare, like some of the, ooh, monkey sounds. So I had to include those there as is. And so for the most part, it was the Wave Station, the Roland U220, and the Roland R8, and Hollywood something Premiere Edition sound effects. Does that answer your question? All right. Anybody else? Yes. I would say that these soundtracks were definitely made with the limitations in mind, and in a lot of ways the limitations had informed some of the sounds that were done. Because, for example, a lot of the sound effects for these games were musical instruments. Like, were just musical instruments repurposed. And if you know the game, actually the sound of the rhino panting is just a hi-hat. It's like down, like sped down. So they did a lot of it definitely informed what they did for the first part of your question. It definitely informed what they did. And I do think that there is no way that we can know what they would have done had they not had these limitations. But that's not my goal. My goal is not to sort of like bypass the limitations, say, hey, this is exactly what these composers would have done if they didn't have these limitations. No, it's to create what it sounded like in our heads as children when we first heard these in our childhood. And I've had people comment this to me on YouTube, like they say it sounds like it did in my head when I was a kid. And that's really the goal that we're going for. We're putting these compositions in a modern studio environment and making them and recreating them as clear as we can, so that you can really hear what you loved about the soundtrack much more. You're welcome. And you? Yes. That it does noise. Yes, it does it for the snake. Like when you hit a snake, this is like noise generation. Other than that, there was no noise generation no, there was no noise generation in it. But the Super Nintendo did have the capability to create some of its own waves, like some of its own synth, like single cycle oscillations. And there was a couple of times when that was used in the Donkey Kong Country series, so I did have to like approximate that. Yes. Say that last part again. Oh man, I would have to say definitely Mining Melancholy from the second game, and Stickerbush Symphony, Forest Interlude, and Aquatic Ambience would be. And actually, the boss tune from the first game was really incredible, I felt, and the bee chase scene, Run Rambi Run, was one of my personal favorites. Okay, yes. Yes, so I would say about 5% is creative liberty that can't be approximated. Because you think about it, like all the volume data has to be approximated. It can't be, like, it's not communicated in the MIDI. So the volume data, the pitch data, like if there's any vibrato and the envelopes and stuff like that, they all have to be approximated. And I have taken great lengths to try to make those as accurate as possible. Yes. Oh yeah, like this. So this soundtrack in particular was composed by mainly David Wise, but there was also a lot of tracks that someone named Evelyn Fisher did, and she a lot of times would compose her tracks in. It was like, if you know anything about music, it's like a different timing. It was like a 3/4, like it was like a 4/4 song in a 3/4 shell. I think I can remember it as. But basically, the timing was not very well read by the computer, and so everything was out of time, and I had to stretch everything and just, you know, it's a very painstaking process. And a lot of times there's a lot of other things that go into it that make this process very hard, but definitely the hardest part was finding the sounds that were used in its entirety. Okay, any more questions? Yes, sir. YouTube, yeah, I'm on Jammin' Sam Miller, JAMMINSAMMILLER. You can find me on YouTube. You can also see the work that I've done, the original work that I've done at jamandsammiller.com. And you can also contact me on Twitter at Prince Samlet and Instagram at jamandsammiller. And I think that's it. But yeah, so I am not going to be doing any more of these soundtracks. I've had people ask me like, hey, can you do this soundtrack? Can you do this soundtrack? And so I just can't, like, I have to be sitting and listening to these for 6 hours, and I just can't, some of them I just can't stand to sit that long and listen for. But I did these soundtracks, like the Donkey Kong Country soundtracks and Super Metroid, because I really enjoyed the soundtracks. But if I were to do another soundtrack, I would have to be hired and commissioned to do so. So I haven't really been doing any of that. But I am looking at pretty soon doing more remix work, like as in my own takes on these tracks. And I'm also looking at doing original scoring for games. So I'm hoping to be able to do more of that in the future. But I have all my work is open source. You can see the live streams that I did where I did the song from start to finish. And you can also see the project files on the Dropbox. So if anyone is wanting to follow up this work, and they have you know, a DAW that like they have FL Studio, they can follow it up if they wanted to. Do you have a question? Well, Glover is going to be a different story entirely because that is a Nintendo 64 game, and I don't know the technical process to get the music data from the ROM on that. I'm sure it's easier because, but I have a friend who does Nintendo 64 games. El Spyro, I know, does Nintendo 64 games, and she does a different process. So it's more of a technical process. So, but if I were to get the opportunity to, I would love to do Glover because Glover had an incredibly amazing soundtrack and an incredibly terrible sound quality. So, but yes, Glover would be great. Anybody else? Yes, sir. Any legal trouble? A little bit. When I first tried to join the YouTube partnership program, I think I got rejected at first, and then the second time I got accepted. But the only legal ramifications here are really that I cannot sell these tracks, which is one reason that they're free. But I can accept donations, but I can't directly sell these tracks. And when I was making my vinyl, I also have a vinyl of this out, by the way. You can order the vinyl if you just with a simple Google search. But when I was making the vinyl, the label had to go through like a licensing process with Nintendo. But for the most part, Nintendo is notorious for taking down projects related to their older works. For the most part, Nintendo has left me alone. I haven't heard from them, so that's a good sign. No news is good news. All right, anybody else? All right, thank you very much. Oh, yes. Yeah, Donkey Kong Country Restored vinyl. It's on a store online, I believe, called Light in the Attic. So you can find it on lightintheattic.com or .net, I think, but it should come up Light in the Attic. Donkey Kong Country Restored. All right, you're welcome. Anybody else? Going once, going twice. Sold. And that is my panel. Thank you, everybody.